As often happens, I'll be struck with inspiration for a podcast episode when I'm on Twitter. Twitter has a lot of positives about it, a lot of negatives about it, social media in general, but it can be inspiring to me for sure in a filmmaking sense, particularly. And I noticed in the last few days, I mean, literally just the last few days, a handful, if not more, long form projects shot on smartphones. And so that struck me as interesting. So I tweeted about it. And now I'm going to talk about it. Hey guys, Blake Calhoun, and another episode of Almost Professional, the podcast about mobile filmmaking, DIY filmmaking, indie filmmaking, really all things filmmaking. And yeah, what's the deal? I mean, I'm seeing lots of projects shot on smartphones, and I don't mean short films. Not to take anything away from short films, but I'm talking feature length and series length projects, meaning long form. I think it's great. I also think it's interesting, and I'm trying to figure out why. Before I get into the why, though, let me just list here the projects, and maybe you've seen a couple of these floating around Twitter or YouTube, etc. The first one is a thriller called Threshold, and it is really well done. Again, the trailer, I haven't seen the movie, but it was shot with 2 phones over 12 days with a 2-person crew. The second one I just saw today is actually a Western called The Woman Who Robbed the Stagecoach. And wow, it had a lot going on in the trailer, meaning production value, wardrobe. I mean, it was a Western. Not something you normally think of when you're talking about low budget, micro budget filmmaking. And that's usually what phones are used for. Another one was called Paralysis. It's a feature film, and I saw it connected to Susie Botello, who you probably know. If you don't, she has a podcast, but she also runs a film festival. I believe it's in San Diego. Yeah, I actually know it's in San Diego, a mobile film festival. So they tagged her in a post, but again, it's another feature shot on a phone. I don't know which phone they're using. And then another one linked to her is called Surveilled. And again, another feature film shot on a phone. And then if you follow mobile filmmaking, you probably know who Courtney Jones is. And he has a new pilot called Uprising. And it's a series. I don't know how long the pilot is, but normally a pilot is going to be 22 minutes at least. And he shot that on an iPhone 12 Pro Max. And then there's the film from last week. I mean, again, there's a lot of films here. Just in the last week, I've heard about films and series all shot on phones, but this one is probably the most high profile, in quotes, because it's sold. And it's called Sharon, spelled with a C, Charon. It's a thriller that this actress, director, producer, I think it looks like a one-person crew kind of thing. She shot it during the pandemic, or made it look like she shot it during the pandemic. It's a pandemic type thriller, but it got distribution. So as I'm surfing Twitter and seeing all this, I'm just struck by, wow, this is really cool. And it's also kind of like, why? Why am I seeing so much of this? You've been able to use your phone to make a movie for really 10 years. Maybe not 10 years, because before, well, I mean, you could shoot a movie, of course, on a VHS camera. And a lot of people did back in the day. But I guess the iPhone 6S, or maybe it was the 6, allowed you to shoot 4K. And so while I'm a big believer and it doesn't really matter what you shoot your project on, I've made mini DV movies, and there was a lot of mini DV movies made in the early 2000s that did well. And so you're talking about standard def, low quality video by today's standards, and those were successful. But I do think a certain level of quality especially today, audiences are spoiled because cameras are so good today, even cheap cameras, including phones, that it has to at least look semi-professional, almost professional, to use the name of my show here. But again, we've been able to do that for a while. And of course, not to mention on traditional cameras. And traditional cameras today are, in quotes, cheap. You can get a really good camera. I mean, you can get used cameras in the hundreds of dollars. You can get new cameras, for under $1,000 or less that will shoot high quality video. I mean, less than a new phone, actually. So it's not really a money thing, I don't think. But what is it? And that's what I want to analyze here for a moment. For some people, I know cost is a factor of using phones. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me because phones are expensive and no one buys a phone just as a video camera. You're also using it for everything else in your life. And so while cost does play a part, I think it's really more about the accessibility. And I guess that is somewhat cost, but meaning that everyone already has a phone. You've already got the phone. And so maybe that's why the combination of the phone being higher quality, the cameras, I mean, and then you got it, you own the phone. And then most people know how to shoot video today, for better or worse. That's a whole nother topic. But so ease of use, it's ubiquitous. You already have it. It's accessible. And then I also think that it's more accepted now to shoot on mobile. When you've got guys like Steven Soderbergh making movies on phones, that helps the cause quite a bit. And so there's not as much of a stigma. I mean, there are people that, especially filmmakers, and I use that in quotes, there are filmmakers that look down on smartphone production, which I think is stupid. They will regret that later. I've talked about this numerous times on my podcast. But the same thing was the case with DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. And I actually kind of did look down at those. I mean, they looked stupid. They were just dumb when they first came out. The footage looked great, but I meant the actual camera. When you come from the big boy cameras, from the Betacams, from the Vericams, from the Digi-Betacams, the $100,000 cameras, to using a little, what the hell is this camera on set, they were scorned. People mocked them. That's not the case anymore, really, as a general rule. They're pretty much revered, especially on YouTube. You're not really using those necessarily to make a movie at Sundance. Blackmagic cameras get used and some Canon cameras get used, but it's mainly still the land of Alexa, even on low budget films, or Red Komodos now has become pretty popular. So that's all to say that cameras really aren't a barrier either, at least in my opinion. Maybe I'm spoiled because I do have several cameras at my disposal, but it's not really a limiting factor today. You can get a camera for a cheap price and you can get good quality. So what else is there? I would probably say that the mental barrier to getting started is much smaller with a phone, especially for newbies, for beginners. Even using a mirrorless camera can, be more complicated or complex. Although in reality, it's not true, it's more perceived. But I do think, again, because you have a phone, you shoot routine video on your phone, using an app like Filmic Pro is the next logical step for a lot of people. And you can get really good results, especially if you know what you're doing, meaning composition and framing and lighting and that kind of stuff. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And so all those things together make it, I guess, more liberating, a liberating feeling, knowing that you can greenlight your own movie really at any time. Now, yeah, of course, there are other expenses, depending on what you're shooting. If you're making a movie like Sharon that I just mentioned, my guess is she didn't spend any money on that movie because it looked like it was shot in her house and she was talking to someone else on another computer and she was kind of going crazy. She was in lockdown. That would be a much easier, and I use that word in quotes, there's nothing easy about making a movie, but that would be easier logistically than, for instance, making the Western that I mentioned. That Western, you're going to spend some money. Again, the wardrobe, you got to have a Western town. You got extras, you got a large cast of characters. Even if you're paying people like $100 a day, that adds up. And so it depends on your project, of course, but it's still, I think, easier for some people to start because, as I've said before, most filmmakers, maybe not as much today because gear is so accessible and affordable, but most filmmakers just talk and they love discussing things on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, in person, at lunch, over beers, over drinks, and they never actually do anything. They never actually make a movie. They write a script, but they never do it. And that's one thing about phones in particular, but I guess just the world we live in now. If you don't do it, it's because of your own hang up. There's no excuse. And even money's not an excuse because, yeah, you don't have any money. Well, make a movie like Sharon that is just set in your house and you're talking to a computer. You're talking to another person on Zoom or whatever. And that is one tangent, though. And I mentioned lighting and, cinematography earlier. For me, that is the one thing, though, that you don't want to screw up, for lack of a better word. I don't like when I see a smartphone movie, whether it's a short film or a feature, and they just treat it like it's a phone. And what I mean by that is they don't treat it like they're making a movie with a traditional camera, or some people like to say, a real camera. Ooh, I hate when they say that. As if your phone isn't a real camera. Your smartphone is a real camera. Don't ever let anyone say any different. It's a different kind of camera. It's not a traditional camera, but it takes pictures and it shoots video. It's a freaking camera, okay? Anyway, my approach, and for instance, I have a smartphone cinematography course, and one of the big things I say is treat your phone like you would any other camera. And what I mean by that is set your exposure properly. Don't use auto settings. Set your shutter. Set your ISO, your white balance, everything. Use an app like Filmic Pro to do this and then shoot in log or flat. Again, just like you would with a Sony mirrorless camera, a different kind of camera, different kind of setup, but similar in the professional way you use it. Now, that's not to say you can't use the phone in creative ways, and that is a big benefit to the phone. Put the phone in a box. That way you open the box and you can get a view from inside the box. Or, the old cliche but classic mailbox shot. Someone opens a mailbox and you can see the point of view of the mailbox. Super easy to do with a phone. You can't do that with an Alexa. You'd have to take the back of the mailbox off and shoot through it. Putting your phone on a gimbal, then attached to the end of a monopod. That way you can walk around and have pseudo drone shots or crane shots. I mean, there's so many different things you can do with a phone that are great and make it more creative, almost like a GoPro in a way. But you have to treat it like any other camera when it comes to everything else. Meaning, again, cinematography, the lighting, you need good lighting, the composition and framing. And of course, you need good sound and you need all those elements that make a good project, that make a movie. Because I do find, and this is more of a beginner thing, but a lot of people using their phone end up skimping on everything else too. And then it doesn't matter what you shot on. You could shoot that on an Alexa. If you're shooting it like that, it doesn't work. It's not good. You probably wouldn't shoot that on Alexa in that case, but you get my point, I think. But all the films I mentioned here, at least what I've seen so far, appear to be taking that approach. Sharon, not quite as much. If you watch that trailer, it looks interesting. It looks actually very compelling, but it kind of looks like a phone. There's a lot of shots where she moves in the frame and the exposure is shifting. I don't think it mattered, though, in that film because it looks like it's a cinema verite, almost documentary style, almost like a not surveillance video of her, but just that style to where you're not looking for a very polished cinematic look. You're looking at it more from like you're looking at it through a phone. And those films are fine, not my favorite. I've never been a fan of like using a phone to tell a story like you're using the phone. In other words, like you're shooting it on the phone. I prefer, again, using the phone as a tool. It's another camera and you rig it out and use it the way you want to use it. But if you're going to be successful in a feature film environment, especially depending on the story again, you need to treat it like you would any other camera. And that's what Courtney did with Uprising. all the stuff I watch. And then in particular, Threshold. Again, I haven't seen much for these other ones except what I saw on Twitter. But Threshold, that actually really grabbed me, and Courtney's Uprising. But back to Threshold, that is more of a raw looking thriller. It's a road movie is what it appears. And they shot it over 12 days with a 2-person crew. And if you didn't know better, you wouldn't know that was shot on a phone. They used 2 iPhone 8 Plus. I believe that's what they used. And I don't know what these other folks used on their projects, but anyway, Courtney's film looks great. Threshold looks great. They all look good. Sharon looks very good in more of a mobile video way. The other ones look more like traditional movies, and that's what I prefer. And I'm glad to see it, because in the end, and this is my key point, even though I am a huge proponent of smartphone filmmaking, obviously I have a channel, The iPhoneographers, dedicated to it on YouTube, a website, Twitter, etc. In the end, I don't want to know what you shot on as an audience member. As a filmmaker, I think it's cool, but I don't want the audience to know. And I get it. Like all these films here, the Western did it, and then Sharon did it. They're promoting it as shot on a phone. And that's a marketing thing, and I get that. That's okay. It reminds me of Clerks back in the day. They promoted that movie cost $25,000 or whatever it was. That was part of the marketing pitch to people. That way you could go, wow, this thing looks pretty terrible and the acting's really bad, but they only spent 25 grand on it, so we'll give it a break. Now, I personally like Clerks a lot and think it's a funny movie, and I love that style, that indie style, black and white and all that. But it's a marketing ploy, and it worked. It worked for that, and it works here too. Like the Western, they're promoting it as the first Western shot on a smartphone. I don't know if that's true or not. It is amazing how many films are made now, period, but also on smartphones. And so ultimately, it is about getting out and making your movie. But as an audience member, I don't care, or I don't want people to know what it was shot on, because that means they're being distracted or they're having to make excuses for something. And today, with pretty much every camera, including smartphones, there's not a lot of compromise anymore. If you take the time and you light it right, you use the right app, use the right color grading, etc., you can make a film that a general audience member will not know whether it was shot on your iPhone or a high-end professional camera. And so there are no excuses. If you want to make a movie today, just like these 4, 5, 6 projects I just listed, get out there and do it. Well, a little bit of a rambling episode today, but I am very intrigued and interested, and any other descriptive word I can think of, on this recent surge of smartphone-produced long-form content. It's very interesting to me. And I think part of the reason it's interesting is I have been thinking about doing it myself. I've made several short films, but I've been really considering making a feature-length project on my phone. And I have a couple ideas, and so that is something I'm exploring. So seeing these other people do it is inspiring me too. I mean, I say this probably each year, the phones get better, but the 12 Pro Max this year made a substantial upgrade in my mind because of the 10-bit video and the larger sensor and the Log V3 from Filmic Pro. A quick anecdote, I was shooting with my 11 Pro Max and my 12 Pro Max in the same room, and I was just stunned at how much better the 12 Pro Max looked under the exact same lighting situation, and it was kind of low light. The 11 Pro Max was grainy and noisy as hell. And so the 12 Pro Max has made a big difference, and that is one reason I have considered taking the plunge to do a feature. And I've done many features in the past. You may or may not know my background. So doing another feature, and this time on an iPhone, may be something I try. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been another episode of Almost Professional. I'm Blake Calhoun, and I look forward to talking to you in the next episode.